Chapter 2 Vietnam. The profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization lies unveiled before our eyes, turning from its home, where it assumes respectable forms, to the colonies, where it goes naked. Karl Marx, August 8, 1853, New York Daily Tribune. Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. Ho Chi Minh. Many friends see only the difficulties that lie ahead and do not see the great victory we have won. The Paris Agreement not only speaks to the failure of aggression of the United States in Vietnam, it marks the failure of the global strategy of the United States to stop liberation struggles of people in many places. Nguyen Thi Binh, January 29, 1973. It is meaning of the ceasefire. It is now more than a year since the signing of the agreement on ending war and restoring peace in Vietnam. For the people in the north and the liberated areas under the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, the great effort of reconstruction to heal the wounds of war has begun. However, since the time of the agreement, more than 73,000 South Vietnamese people have died in combat. 200,000 remain in Tho's prisons. There are no illusions that final peace has come. The people in the liberated zones defend themselves daily against bombings and attacks carried out by Tho's U.S.-trained and equipped army. In the liberated areas of the South, new administrations are being set up to build schools and clinics, to comb the soil for unexploded anti-personnel weapons, readying it for replanting. Near Dong Ha, in Quang Tri province, the people have already harvested their first crop of rice in over 5 years. Slowly, the millions of craters are being filled, though it will take many generations to remove enough soil to fill them all. The towns are being rebuilt, since each town of any size was bombed into dust whenever it was liberated. One puts up with what is available, they say, and out of the rubble and ruins comes adequate structures. In the liberated territories, people are poor, but medical care is free to everyone. People are learning to read, and no one starves. The new life represents the independence and democracy for which the people of South Vietnam have fought so hard. Nixon and Tho have failed both to observe the terms of the agreement they signed. U.S. military advisors disguised as civilians continue to advise and organize Tho's police and army. The U.S. has violated the agreement by sending in new weapons like F-5E jets. The Nixon administration is asking Congress to approve $2.4 billion in military and economic aid to South Vietnam. This is an increase of about 65% over what was approved for last year. When the money for Cambodia and Laos is included, the total Nixon request is $3.5 billion. The administration justifies this increase because of inflation, and now Kissinger is arguing that the U.S. is obligated by the ceasefire agreement to give aid to Tho. South Vietnam is a police state, 90% funded by U.S. tax dollars. This aid makes possible the continued rule of the dictator Tho. The attacks he has ordered launched against the liberated zones are major obstacles to peace and make possible the re-escalation of the war at any time. There is still necessary Vietnam work to be done by the U.S. anti-imperialist movement. A strong movement is the greatest support we could give. It would pressure on Nixon and the government, and it would continue to build our struggle here. As time passes and reconstruction proceeds, the strength of the liberated areas will grow and the power of Tho will be weakened. We can help. We must demand that the Nixon government abide by the agreement and stop aid to Tho. And we must remain vigilant against the possibility of U.S. re-escalation. The Vietnamese struggle is the most significant political event of our generation. Understanding the history of the Vietnam War is key to understand the present world situation, the present U.S. governmental crisis, the present possibilities for the revolutionary movement here, and a correct anti-imperialist perspective. This is the era of national liberation, and for most of the past 15 years, Vietnam has been leading the force in the struggle. The Vietnam War, alongside the struggle of black people, sparked the youth revolt of the 60s and created the conditions for the new left to mature. The relentless barbarity and length of the U.S. aggression became a crucible with which our generation learned about U.S. society. We were forced to see the horror of empire and the real nature of the monster we live in. We discovered imperialism. Many conflicting forces were at work within the youth movement. Progressive characteristics were in conflict with reactionary aspects, and class struggle took place within the culture. The growing independence of young people was a multi-billion-dollar market to be exploited with waste commodities. But during the years of resistance, from the Pentagon and Stop the Draft Week to Kent State and massive protests against the Cambodian invasion, the strength of the growing anti-imperialist forces and consciousness were the best self of the youth revolt. We did at long last get into the fight against the dirtiest of all wars. Slowly, in hesitation and confusion, we responded to the heroism, humanity, and revolutionary principle of an Asian people, led by a saintly and very tough revolutionary, Ho Chi Minh. At the bottom of the page, a photograph of a Vietnamese guerrilla smiling. The draft was an immediate force that pushed us to become an anti-imperialist movement. It was an attack on poor, black, and third world and working class youth. 7 million young men served in the armed forces during the Vietnam War. Few families were spared some direct confrontation with the war machine. At the same time, millions of us took to the streets to protest the 1970 invasion of Cambodia. The seriousness of our threat was growing. The killings of students at Jackson State and Kent State had a significant effect on the youth movement. The war was brought home, and Nixon was determined to have law and order until the U.S. could pull off its peace with honor charade and get U.S. troops out of South Vietnam. What was happening here was only part of a larger process taking place around the world. It took the Vietnamese many years to force the U.S. troop withdrawal. It was 4 years between the Tet Offensive, which broke the back of the invading army, forced Johnson to step down, and the U.S. to negotiate, and the 1972 final offensive. During that time, the anti-war movement reached its greatest strength, and the largest and most militant demonstrations took place. Inspired by the Black Panthers and other black fighters, many whites such as Sam Melville, Cameron Bishop, the New Year's Gang in Madison, and ourselves began building armed struggle. Our movement was undergoing profound changes as the Vietnamese people were leading the struggle against U.S. imperialism. International victory. The Vietnamese built international solidarity around their struggle. They organized a broad, united front against imperialism throughout the world. This international front, of which the movement in the United States is an important part, consisted of many third world nations, the socialist nations, and opposition movements within the imperialist countries. Mass anti-war movements grew, not only in the U.S., but in Japan, France, Great Britain, West Germany, Italy, and Sweden. In an era of intense contradictions among the socialist countries, Vietnam fought for strategic focus on U.S. imperialism as the major enemy of the world's people, and united all socialist countries in support of its struggle. The success of the Vietnamese struggle helped call into being the unity of the non-aligned nations. Historic conferences in Guyana in 1972 and Algeria 1973 recognized the PRG and the Cambodian government in exile of Norodom Sihanouk and sparked the growth of the Progressive Alliance that is becoming an increasingly important force in the world. By tying down the U.S. military forces throughout the 60s, the Vietnamese opened up the space for other third world nations to resist imperialism. With the bulk of U.S. armed forces in Vietnam, including 70% of the Air Force at the height of the air war, the U.S. was not in a position to send the Marines to Chile, nor to intervene for Portugal in Guinea-Bissau. Cuba was able to survive and in turn help Vietnam. This was Che's understanding of 2-3 many Vietnams, a strategy to overextend and defeat U.S. imperialism. The Vietnamese say, if the resistance is strong, even a hawk may be forced to withdraw. If the resistance is weak, even a dove may be tempted to invade. By forcing the U.S. to use its entire array of weapons, Vietnam stripped all pretense from U.S. neocolonialism. Anti-U.S. demonstrations took place in the Philippines, Mexico, Lebanon, Iran, and Argentina. This showed an inherent instability in the U.S. empire. Neocolonial governments faced pressure from their own people to oppose the Vietnam War or face rebellion at home. The U.S. attempt to win the war exacerbated the U.S. balance of payments and produced a monetary crisis. Skyrocketing inflation and unemployment at the same time, supposedly an impossibility under modern capitalism, cut into the living standards of third world people, working people, and the poor throughout the U.S. The deteriorating economic situation of the U.S. has meant that its domination over rivaled advanced capitalist countries is under greater attack and is no longer as secure. The growing strength of Japan and the EEC pose new conflicts for U.S. imperialism. There is no doubt that the present political isolation of U.S. imperialism, evidenced in the recent UN decision to declare Puerto Rico a colony, the Arab and African nations stand against U.S.-backed Israeli Zionism, the world condemnation of the U.S. and NATO support for Portugal's African wars, the admission of the People's Republic of China to the UN, recognition of Cuba by a number of Latin American countries, can be traced to U.S. defeat in Vietnam. National victory. The victory won by the Vietnamese against U.S. imperialism is plainly reflected in the ceasefire agreement. It reads as follows: the United States and all other countries respect the independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Vietnam, as recognized by the 1954 Geneva Agreements on Vietnam, and the United States will not continue its military involvement or intervene in the internal affairs of South Vietnam. The agreement further states that the United States will dismantle its military bases in South Vietnam, will withdraw all military support, including advisors, and will not introduce new military personnel, armaments, munitions, and war material into South Vietnam. This is a statement of the goals of the National Liberation Front since its founding in 1960, goals that the U.S. government was forced to accept and sign after 13 years of aggression. The period of total war and attempted genocide has been defeated, and the U.S. now has been forced into public recognition of the NLF program. The Vietnamese victory came at a phenomenal cost to the Vietnamese people and their homeland. Their suffering was incalculable. Yet their victory is of enormous consequence. The Vietnamese people, throughout massive mobilization and the successful carrying out of a People's War of Liberation, drove out the U.S. invading force, and thereby checked the advance of U.S. imperialism. The Vietnam War shows that an organized, united, third world nation can hold off and eventually defeat the full force of U.S. imperialism. This is a major blow to the U.S. attempt to convince peoples, including those within its own boundaries, that it is invincible. The Vietnamese strategy was based on the mobilization of their own people. They raised People's War to a new level of heroism and humanity, applying the strategy to Vietnamese conditions. The Vietnamese say, if the resistance is strong, even a hawk may be forced to withdraw. If the resistance is weak, even a dove may be tempted to invade. The Vietnamese liberation forces were able to defeat each successive U.S. strategy. The Tet Offensive of 1968 showed that 500,000 U.S. troops would not be enough to maintain the U.S. in Vietnam. Nixon created the policy of Vietnamization, changing the color of the corpses. Defeated in the invasions of Cambodia and Laos, and in the 1972 final offensive. It was these defeats, capped by the failure of Nixon's late December bombings of Hanoi and Haiphong, which forced him to withdraw U.S. forces just as the French were obliged to withdraw after their defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The Vietnamese referred to the destruction of 1/5 of the entire U.S. B-52 fleet over Hanoi and Haiphong during the bombings as the Dien Bien Phu of the skies. Chapter 1, Article 1 of the ceasefire agreement states simply and clearly that the U.S. accepts the definition of Vietnam, recognized by the 1954 Geneva Agreements on Vietnam. This says that Vietnam is one country, temporarily divided. The full measure of U.S. defeat can be judged when one considers that in 1954, the U.S., number 1, refused to accept the Geneva Agreements, and 2, immediately set out to subvert them by installing a neo-colonial puppet regime in Saigon, and 3, fought the longest war in U.S. history to maintain 2 Vietnams. All for Vietnam. The vanguard nature of Vietnamese liberation in the past decade means that we can approach the difficult question of class analysis, consciousness, and potential by looking at how various groups within society were affected by the anti-war struggle. This way we can avoid an idealist or opportunist class analysis and begin with our own understanding, based on practice of the leading anti-imperialist forces in society. Black and third world people, and young people, especially students and members of the armed forces, responded to the Vietnam War in the most consistently principled way. These are the forces within society who kept open the possibility of joint action between the oppressed in our country and those in the third world. Because of its anti-imperialist perspective, the New Left became a cutting edge for the expression of working class consciousness and commitment. Support for the leading forces in the fight against the common enemy is the essential and necessary content of proletarian internationalism here and now. Left image on page 33, Indochina, which has images of Laos, Cambodia, North and South Vietnam. Back to page 34. Many organizations pay lip service to the anti-imperialist struggle, but those movement organizations who in practice did not come to give full support to the Vietnamese struggle as the main priority of class struggle made a serious error. This was especially true during the 1972 final offensive, when between the launching of the offensive on March 31, 1972, and the signing of the ceasefire agreement on January 27, 1973, the slogan of the movement should have been "All for Vietnam." By this measure, we criticize our own practice during the final offensive, when we organized under this slogan but were not successful in carrying out our full program, especially at the time of the Christmas bombings of Hanoi and Haiphong. This does not mean that organizing among women, students, or workers should have been deferred so that we could all work on mobilizations. It does mean that the period of the final offensive was a unique time in history, when a specific struggle of monumentous consequence to the overall weakening of imperialism was in a decisive stage that required full and uncompromising support. It will be a great leap if we can learn to identify those crucial times when a particular anti-imperialist focus becomes the central task of our movement. Today, many of the same errors continue to play themselves out in various movement responses to the continuing imperialist aggression in Southeast Asia. A major error is to be blind to Vietnam's victory. This mistake does not distinguish between victory and final victory. There are many victories still to be won in Vietnam: the defeat of the puppet regime in the South, reunification of the North and South, the consolidation of socialism throughout all of Vietnam. But victory in revolution is not like the seventh game of the World Series. Victory is built over time, through a series of successes and failures. When a variety of quantitative changes achieves a point of qualitative change, this can be considered a victory. The defeat of U.S. ground troops provides an example. For 3 years, the Vietnamese fought the full force of the U.S. armed forces on the ground. In that time, there were many defeats and losses, as well as many victories. By Tet 1968, the successes had become the direction of the war. The Tet Offensive was extremely costly to the Vietnamese liberation fighters. It was also the decisive point in the victory over U.S. ground forces. It was the point at which Vietnamese victory became inevitable, and the remaining question became, at what cost? The Vietnamese demand for this stage of the struggle was for U.S. ground troops to leave their soil to allow the Vietnamese themselves to resolve the conflict. This has been partially achieved and is the essence of the victory of the ceasefire agreement. Another major error is to say that the anti-war movement was powerless and failed to affect the outcome of the war. These are words we hear from Nixon. They are destructive lies. Don't do the state's work. With an enemy as powerful as U.S. imperialism, every people's victory is to be treasured and claimed. To deny the major accomplishments of our movement leaves the people weak and demoralized. In our statement, Common Victories, on the occasion of the signing of the ceasefire agreement, we said, "We urge all opponents of the government's war policies to allow themselves to seize and celebrate this triumph. We welcome the renewal which comes from the sharing of the aspirations of a heroic people. Distrust of the Nixon rulers must not blind us to the light of Vietnam. Without savoring our common victories, we become cynical and paralyzed. Expecting everything, we discard anything less. Now the Vietnamese can order their reunification, plant and harvest, heal and teach, in their own time." The movement played a specific and important role. Without it, the Johnson-Nixon governments would most likely have launched a land invasion of North Vietnam, waged tactical or full nuclear war, started a war with China, or bombed the dikes of North Vietnam. These were all genocidal weapons in the ruling class arsenal. Without a growing anti-war movement, without drastic escalation in the nature and militancy of our resistance, they might have been used. The political cost at home for each successive strategy became an important point in deterring the use of these weapons. A point of great resistance to the war was the May 1970 youth rebellions in response to the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. The uprising forced Nixon into an early withdrawal from Cambodia and resulted in legislation prohibiting direct U.S. intervention in Cambodia. Perhaps most importantly, Nixon did not dare use U.S. massive troops in the subsequent invasion of Laos. This restriction aided the stunning victory of the Pathet Lao, a decisive defeat for Nixon's strategy of extending the war throughout Indochina. The anti-war movement can count other significant successes in a decade of resistance. Never in the entire history of the U.S. did the rulers have a harder time controlling the minds that pulled the triggers than in Vietnam. Active duty enlisted people developed high consciousness about the nature of imperialism. Military insubordination, desertion, sabotage, and fragging weakened the Imperial Army and made it unreliable. As a result, U.S. ground forces can no longer be counted upon as a dependable weapon of counterinsurgency. It is very difficult to imagine sending an army that has so many black and third world soldiers to put down wars of liberation in Africa or to side with Israeli Zionism in the Mideast. Military conscription has been abolished. The volunteer army is somewhat a futile attempt to rebuild a strong military by eliminating the unwilling draftee. Top of page 36, 2 images. Ta Ti Koo, guerrilla leader. Nguyen Van Choi, shot for attempting to execute Defense Secretary McNamara, 1965. A third major error is to say that the struggle of an underdeveloped country like Vietnam is so fundamentally different from our own that there are no lessons to be learned. The Vietnamese people have taught us a lot if we are able to open ourselves and learn. They have shown in practice how to build a revolutionary culture based on internationalism and total commitment to the struggle. In the days immediately following the coup in Chile, the police occupied a large factory. About 20 workers died in combat, and a young Vietnamese who had been there since 1973, learning the technology of food production, climbed on the roof, filled his pockets with dynamite sticks, and jumped on top of a police bus as it was coming into the courtyard. He was killed along with 40 policemen. The Vietnamese have shown in practice how to respond to setbacks and defeat by mobilizing and continuing to build forward motion. Victory lies in collective unity, courage, and sacrifice. The leading role of women in the Vietnamese struggle has been a lesson and an inspiration to oppress people everywhere. The high number of women in Thao's jails, over 100,000, indicates the role women play in the liberation movement. Tens of thousands have been active in the guerrilla army. The Women's Union of South Vietnam has been a leading organization of the liberation struggle. Elderly women compose the army of mothers of fighters, bringing food and medicine to soldiers on the battlefield. The desertion rate of the Saigon Army, which soared to 20,000 per month during the 1972 final offensive, was partly the work of the political army of women known as the Long-Haired Army. In 1970, while working in the rice fields, a mother and daughter-in-law were raped and killed by U.S. soldiers. This drove a group of Saigon women, including Miss No Man Tom, a lawyer with a Ph.D. from Columbia University, to organize the committee to defend the right to live and the dignity of Vietnamese women. Their demands were that the dignity of women be respected, that the right of women to struggle be recognized, that U.S. troops be withdrawn, and a coalition government in South Vietnam be formed. Two Vietnamese women leaders are especially known and loved around the world. Madame Nguyen Thanh Binh is the foreign minister of the PRG of SVN. Now 47, she has participated continuously in the struggle since she was 18 years old. At 24, she was imprisoned and tortured by the South Vietnamese police under French direction. Today, she is working in her office in Quang Tri province. Madame Nguyen Thi Dinh, from a poor peasant family, is now the deputy commander-in-chief of the army of the PRG of SVN. She was 17 when she joined the resistance. In 1945, she led the first armed uprising against the French, and in 1960, she led the first armed uprising against the U.S.-supported dictatorship of Nguyen Thanh Diem. Prior to the Vietnamese victory, the U.S. seemed invincible. In our lifetime, we had not been aware of any U.S. defeat. Of course, the U.S. didn't win in Korea, but this information was skillfully hidden from us. This knowledge affects our ability to conceive of revolution in our country. The Vietnamese organized around the idea that there is a difference between the people of the U.S. and the government of the U.S. By doing so, they helped make it real. A major reason for the success of the anti-war movement here was the friendship extended by the Vietnamese people to the U.S. people. The significance of the ceasefire agreement is that strength of the people. In Vietnam, around the world, in the U.S. itself, was pitted against a handful of men who control technological power and the means of violence. A small, poor country can defeat the largest, richest power in the world, provided its people are united and its cause is just. What an ominous message for the U.S. empire. What an inspiration and comfort for all people. Support the Vietnamese struggle. People are protest-weary, and now some have been put to sleep. They believe the media, not only that the war is over, but that the conflict has receded into the background. Our movement is very much undermined by accepting these lies. Not only does it alienate us from our history, and so prevent a maturing of movement, but it is also a betrayal of the Vietnamese people. We cannot make the mistake of waiting until the war heats up again to respond to imperialist plans. Our inaction increases the chances of U.S. military reintervention. Toe would fall if the U.S. cut off all aid. Support for the Vietnamese Revolution can be incorporated into individual practice as well as the program of anti-imperialist organizations. Whatever work we do in daycare centers, in factories, on the streets, or in jails, education about Vietnam, support for the demands of the Vietnamese people, and resistance to Nixon's aggression are priorities for revolutionaries organizing at this time. Vietnam should play a role in our everyday work. It is true that Vietnam work cannot be sustained if it is isolated from the building of the left. However, a left which does not relate to Vietnam is not a healthy left. 4 main issues. Attacks on liberated zones. Toe and his administration have been saying that they expect a military offensive by the North, but it is Toe's forces that are guilty of attacking and attempting to reconquer liberated territory. South Vietnamese pilots have dropped U.S.-made bombs from U.S.-made planes all over the liberated zones. Toe is using the pretext of an offensive to cover his own violations of the agreement and as an excuse to get more advanced weapons and more money from the U.S. in violation of the agreement. His friend Nixon may not last as long as the U.S. president, and Toe knows he has little support left. No aid to Toe. In the agreement, the U.S. recognized the reality of 2 separate zones of administration, 2 governments, and 2 armies in the South. Nixon has since denied this in his statements. In the agreement, the U.S. pledged not to impose an administration or political personality to respect the South Vietnamese people's right to self-determination. But U.S. aid and weapons maintain the Toe administration. We must warn the people of the risk of war. Healing the wounds of war. The U.S. has failed to honor Article 21 of the agreement, which calls for the U.S. to contribute to the healing wounds of the war and to post-war reconstruction of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and throughout Indochina. Political prisoners. The agreement calls for the release of all political prisoners held in Toe's prisons, but over 200,000 people remain imprisoned by Toe for political beliefs and actions. At the time of the signing of the agreement, Toe reclassified thousands of political prisoners as common criminals as a tactic to avoid their release. Many of these people are leaders of the anti-Toe, non-communist neutralist group, the third force in South Vietnamese politics. According to the terms of the agreement, they are supported to help form the new tripatriot government of national reconciliation and concord. Their release is essential to the successful implementation of the agreement. The South Vietnamese prisons and tiger cages are built by the U.S. construction combine RMK-BRJ, Raymond, Morrison, Knudsen, Brown, Root, and Jones. Smith & Wesson manufactures the handcuffs used in Saigon prisons. Prison officials are trained and their funds are supplied by only one source, the U.S. government. Illustration of a guerrilla fighter from Vietnam. A program to focus on Vietnam. justice to war criminals, amnesty for resistors. The criminals of this period are the aggressors, the imperialists, the war makers. Some are corporate leaders who built the sophisticated tools of death. Some are government bureaucrats who wrote the contingency plans for bombing the dikes, those responsible for ecological devastation and teaching new methods of torture. Some are the perpetrators of massacres and urban bombings. The Pentagon Papers give a partial list of the crimes and the criminals. The Watergate revelations and the dissection of the Nixon organization provides another partial listing. The criminals must be brought to justice. The heroes and heroines of this period are those who opposed, no matter how inarticulately, no matter what the medium, the aggression in Vietnam. This includes deserters and draft resistors, those dishonorably discharged and those still in stockades, the court-martialed and the fraggers. It includes the thousands of GIs who left the service with less than honorable discharges. It also includes civilians who were arrested and charged with acts of opposing the war, those who lost jobs and sacrificed careers, those who are fugitives or still in prison for their opposition. Those who oppose the war in Vietnam deserve total vindication. Raise the demand. A single type discharge for all veterans. Unconditional amnesty for all war resistors. The war to explain the war. The falsification of the history of the Vietnam War began years ago and continues to this day. The falsification of history is a most powerful weapon used against black people, working people, women, and Native Americans. Nixon and his strategic advisors, his coterie of ad men, have generated vast energy, spent millions of dollars, and used every political swindle to hide the true story of the Vietnam War from the U.S. people. Nixon and his class are scared because the Vietnam War exposed so much. It is essential to them to convince the U.S. people that withdrawal was peace with honor, that resistance to the war inside the U.S. never had any effect or consequence on its end, that Vietnam was the most selfless war in history. The barbaric Christmas bombing was murder for propaganda, a cruel attempt to cover U.S. defeat with a show of terror. POWs have been used, trying to whip up a mood of teeny patriotism and panicky reaction where it would be easy to attack anti-war people and justify the most barbarous Nixon policies. It hasn't worked, but the battle is far from over. We must all become teachers using pictures, maps, books, slides, and newspaper clippings as tools. The true history of Vietnam must be taken to the people and fought for. The war to explain the war should not be taken lightly by us. It is taken dead seriously by our enemies. The Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam. The Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam is an internationally recognized government. It receives aid from many socialist countries. In a beautiful and historic act of international solidarity, Fidel Castro visited Quang Tri province last year, the first head of state to enter liberated South Vietnam. In the liberated zones, the foundation for socialism is being built. South Vietnam could possibly develop the next socialist revolution to occur in the world. Support for the PRG is a priority. Life in the liberated zones of South Vietnam is organized collectively and run for the benefit of the whole people. North Vietnam has made tremendous sacrifices and served as the base area for the liberation in the South. With time, the liberated zones will grow in size and population, and as more and more Vietnamese flee the oppression and dislocation of life under tow. Without the countryside, the cities cannot survive and will eventually fall. The liberation armed forces continue to grow and continue to retaliate for attacks made by To's forces against the PRG territory. Only a massive reintervention of U.S. ground troops can postpone the eventual collapse of the Saigon regime. Recognizing this, Nixon tries to ignore the PRG, referring to To as the legitimate government of South Vietnam. The strength of our support for the PRG will affect how long it takes for reunification to occur. The revolutionary movement must demand that the ceasefire agreement be upheld and raise the slogan, Defend the PRG, No Aid to To, Free all political prisoners, Defend the PRG, Hands off Laos, U.S. out of Cambodia. We are a people who understand the price of solidarity. Many people who are living in comfort, who do not suffer from hunger or cold, whose house stays warm for 100 years, not destroyed at all, they do not understand the price of solidarity. But we understand what solidarity means, no matter how small it may be. In our people, there is a saying, a piece of bread for you when you are hungry is more precious than a banquet when you are better. That is why, dear friends, don't believe that your actions are so ineffective. Please don't believe here that anything you state in solidarity with Vietnam, anything you are doing, any minute you spend in the cold before the American embassy, any posters painted on the walls, all these acts are more valuable for us than the gold you may give us. Le Vin Cao, PRG Representative, December 2nd, 1972. Page 43. An illustration of Fidel Castro and Madame Nguyen Thi Binh.